all of a sudden I'm standing out in front of St. Peter's. I get whisked away to the chapel where the Pope venerates the image. Some nun from Poland walks out and gives me a ticket. Next thing you know, I'm at the canonization. Now that's God.
Hello, welcome to Cajun Miracles. I have again with me my guest, Greg Schwab. Hello, Greg.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
And what we're going to talk about today, Greg?
Well, you gave me another opportunity to kind of finish a little more about the story where we left off, and as you would expect, in the intervening week, I thought of a couple things that I left out of the story that might need to be told. So one of them, going back to my experience at Conyers, when I was having that experience, while the Blessed Mother was appearing to Nancy Fowler, one of the things that occurred and one of the things that I learned, while I'm having that locution, if you would, God's presence so powerful, like I said last time, speaking, it wasn't audible, but it was almost like food, if you would, information that bypassed your brain and just, it became a knowing beyond thinking. And one of the things that I learned and experienced at that time, for years, a non-practicing Catholic per se, certainly not going to weekly mass, I had thought to myself that surely we wouldn't have to confess our sins to a priest in order to be forgiven by God. And so while this was happening, I was given to know, if you would, that confession was in fact an act of, in other words, it was a sacrament, and it was an act of Jesus. And I was given to know that, Jesus literally sits in, or the priest sit in the place of Jesus. He uses their bodies, if you would. And that the sacrament of confession was in fact real, and it was legitimate, and I needed it. And so without having, so I never had to think about it again. I never had to wonder about it again. And so all those areas that I had been taught, if you would, directly by God, I never had to think about again. So, one of the most greatest gifts that somebody could ever receive is not to have to wonder anymore. I know, there's no question. And so, but be that as it may, the next day, the following day, as I mentioned, I got back to my office, which is downtown Houma, and my secretary at the time, Laura, actually pointed down and directed me to where Father Dwayne's name was on the paper, of course. But an interesting thing happened that same day, which was the following day after my experience. My secretary, who is, I think, probably born Catholic, but certainly not practicing Catholic, to my knowledge. And at the time, she wasn't, at least. But she had received a book now, she didn't know anything about what happened the previous day. I didn't come to the office telling anybody anything. Nobody knew a thing. And she just walked in that day, and she said, I just had to give you this book. And she handed me this book, which, not this book, but a version, an edition of this book, 30 years ago, in other words.
That's an unusual book to give somebody. That's such a deep book.
She had never read it. She said, I never read this book, and someone gave this book to me, and she said, I was just moved to bring it to you for some reason. And so I had never heard of this. I didn't know what she was giving me. And I had, as it turns out, this book is, in fact, the diary of St. Faustina. So for those of you who don't know, it's a A very powerful book. I can honestly say that she handed me the most important book I've ever read in my entire life, except for the Bible, of course. It literally helped change my life. So, but the more interesting point was, not only did I meet Father Dwayne Stenzel that same day, who helped shape and form me like nobody else has in my entire life, but I received a book, and by the time I had read probably 30 pages, 35 pages, I had read enough to know that, and I had never learned about anything about this. I didn't know what had happened to me, but I literally was reading on the pages of this book the same similar thing that happened to her. So I'm reading the book, and literally it's like God is sitting there in the room saying, this is what happened to you yesterday, by the way. And so not only was it, reading the fact that a saint's writing this book about her own experiences with God, speaking to her, leading her, guiding her, teaching her, but also the fact that it involved mercy. In other words, the overarching theme of this book, once you read the whole thing, and you can read a couple pages, figure it out, it's all about God's infinite mercy. So he knocked me off the horse in one day. The next day, he introduces me to my teacher, we were just talking about it a few minutes ago. We have literally boxes full of spiritual books that we read together with and in concert together, you and I and a couple of the guys and Father Dwayne. And then also, I was taught the next day exactly what I was literally called to do probably for the rest of my life. No doubt it was my calling. When I read this book, and it was the weirdest thing in that I'm not really I'm a touchy-feely person, but how do I explain this? I'm not somebody who is easily moved by emotion, let's just say. I'm not an emotional person per se. Well, I felt such a kindred spirit with this saint who wrote this book. It was as if she were my best friend. I cannot explain the depth of how, at least emotionally, I felt about this writer, this saint. So I read her book, and literally I lived this divine mercy the day before. I lived it. I experienced it. I know exactly what she's talking about. And having received God's mercy to that extent, when you didn't even ask for it, you didn't even really know anything about it, it immersed me in God's mercy so powerfully that I understand what she's writing very well, and I knew that I needed to tell everybody. Well, as you know, after you first have a massive conversion in your life or some super spiritual experience, you run around like a madman. I guess God made us that way. It's just our nature. I got to tell most of my favorite people in case I die, or I'm like, man, you got to know this before you die.
You can't hold it in.
You can't. And you turn into a maniac, socially, a social pariah, a lot of us. But it's so true. It's like, you don't understand. This is like, it's not a fantasy. It's not a theory. It's literally true. I mean, you got to understand this, and this is the good news. And so, long story short, time passes. Of course, I meet you, I meet Paul, meet a lot of other guys, start daily mass, et cetera, learn about Jesus being present in the Eucharist, understand better my faith. And so one day, this is probably 4 or so years later. Now, you got to understand, I have become a devotee of Saint Faustina in the writings and the teachings and the devotions that she taught, I'm being asked out of the blue occasionally to go and even talk about St. Faustina, teach on her teachings. And so I'm reading it more, I'm studying it. It becomes part of my life. And then all of a sudden, if you understand parts of her diary, one of the things Jesus had asked her back in the 1930s was to help start the Feast of Mercy in the church, recognized by the church. Now, if you read this diary, you understand that things don't happen like you would expect in our time. And when he was saying help and do, and she felt so pressure, she was like, I got to do this, and I'm failing, and nothing's working, and da-da-da-da. Well, she died in 1938, as a matter of fact. And so I saw over time, reading, just books and things and articles, how slowly it was taking to come to fruition, because the church, a lot of priests didn't even know what it was. Now, it has now been recognized by the church as a feast day, and her teachings have been recognized as being authentic, worthy of being, believed. And in fact, what she was called the Secretary of Mercy, because God appointed her to learn and teach. She was uneducated, could barely write anything, and she literally was a scrivener, if you would, about things God told her, and then of course her own stuff. So it's all incredible. So, but long story short, it's coming around to about the year 2000, and as it turns out, of all the years that could have happened, Pope John Paul II proclaimed that the Feast of Divine Mercy would begin in earnest, recognized by the church, celebrated on every Sunday after Easter in the year 2000. It was the Jubilee year. Not only that, but St. Faustina was going to be canonized on the same day, recognized by the church as a saint. Miracles have occurred. The church has sat on it long enough and says, okay, it's worthy. She is a saint. There's no doubt. Her teachings are worthy of belief. And not only that, we haven't started a new feast day in the church in, who knows how many years. But we're going to start it on whatever it was, April or May of 2000, the same day that she's going to be canonized. So I'm, of course, interiorly thinking, nobody else understands this. It's sort of fruity, I guess, to some extent, but it's so true, at least to me. I'm interiorly thinking, it's like a sister. And man, I feel terrible that I'm not doing something for her, And over time, I began to understand that, in other words, in the history of the world, there are things that occur, and that will, in other words, there might be 2,000 more years from now. But it's been, at that time, it was 2,000 years since the time of Christ. I just understood that it was such a momentous day in the church, and in all time. I understood how important the day was. The message of divine mercy is so intensely, it's probably the most important message that we all need to learn. And we don't, because we don't think we're not worthy of divine mercy. That's the point. We're not worthy, really. It's God's grace. He gives it to us before we're, worthy. Not that we ever really are. And so I understood interiorly how important the day was. Well, one day, I don't know, it was early, probably 2000. I'm working, and I just felt nudged to go to the Adoration Chapel in the middle of the day, probably in the morning, I think it was, at St. Francis, where they have an Adoration Chapel. And I sat there, and, sometimes we sit before Jesus and pray. Sometimes we sit there and contemplate. We learned about contemplative prayer from Father Duane. And I probably was there just in contemplative prayer, not thinking about anything in particular. And the thought came to me that if your sister were graduating in Europe, would it be the right thing for you to go? And I thought to myself, in my family, those kind of things are important, extremely important. And if you don't go to your sister's graduation, shame on you, right? In my own family. So I thought interiorly that, shame on me if, I didn't even think about going. I'm not interested in going to Europe. When I was 19, I traveled for a whole year around the globe and up with people. And so we lived in different people's houses. I'm not a traveler anymore. I did it for a whole year. I lived on a bus, and I didn't want to travel anymore. So it wasn't my idea. And I'm working, and I got, I don't know at the time how many kids I had, but trust me, we didn't have any extra to spend. And so the next thought came to me after dropping that thought in my brain very powerfully. It was like, well, not a it's a good idea. It was a I want you to go. It was so strong that I want you to go. Wasn't audible, of course, but it was a knowing. No. This is your sister graduating. I want you there. And I'm thinking to myself, it was a couple days away by the time I'm having this experience. I don't know the first thing to do. Well, I leave the chapel, go straight to my office. I call Mary Bordelon, who was working in a travel agency at the time. I say, Mary, what are the odds that you could get me a flight to Rome in the next week or two or whatever it is? And she's like, oh, Greg, are you talking about going to Rome for the canonization of St. Faustina? I said, yeah. She goes, oh, Greg, it's so late. Hang on. So I don't know if she called me back, but anyway, as it turns out, they had exactly 3 more seats on the plane. So I jumped on that plane. Then she found a hotel. It was the last hotel she could possibly find us and get us a room. So I ended up going and flying to Rome. But before I did, another interesting fact was I called a friend of mine, Jay Alexius. Jay was an emergency room doctor at the time, and, I knew that he knew a little Italian, and he's he's a brilliant guy. And I knew he had been to Italy. So I knew, and he's very good with history. So I called him and said, listen, I want to go to St. Faustina's canonization. Are you interested in coming? He goes, yeah, I'll go. So he was sort of the tour guide. He was the guy who made all the decisions and spoke, and I had my I just had to shut my mouth, and he helped with all the planning and everything else. So we go to Rome. Long story short, it's the night before the canonization. Now, we've been there a few days. We visited the Vatican. It was just mind-blowingly beautiful. And it's a couple of days before the canonization. And as it turns out, unbeknownst to us, you got to have tickets to get into this deal. We don't have no tickets. We didn't even know we needed tickets. Well, I would say about the day before the canonization, we're walking down the streets of Rome, and my wife, of all people, says, hey, you see that nun right there? That's white. And they had nuns and priests everywhere. You see that nun right there? Yeah. I recognize her from EWTN. She talks about she teaches on divine mercy. So she walks up to this is unlike my wife to do. She walks up to this nun and introduces herself and says, I recognize you. Yeah. Let's strike up a conversation. Next thing you know, and she's with another nun. As it turns out, she was the only American to have lived in the convent where St. Faustina was from. And she spoke English, and better yet, she's from Louisiana. Better yet, she's about our age. As it turns out, I end up befriending her and the nun that she's with, they were starting an order in the United States to spread the devotion to divine mercy. It's a whole nother story, but we met them in Rome fortuitously like that, and they just happen to have extra tickets, and they are the ones who instructed us that we needed tickets, I think. So they gave us 3 tickets: Jay, Terry, and myself. My wife Terry and myself. Fast forward that evening, one of those experiences where, it's hard to explain. It doesn't happen often, very seldom, in fact, to me. But this overpowering urge, if you would, a knowing. I knew that I needed to be in Vatican Square the night before the canonization. And I'm thinking to myself, that there's probably going to be a bazillion people there, but I also had the urge to be alone and just quiet and contemplative and pray the chaplet of divine mercy, or just to be present in the most important place in the history of the world on this night, the day before the institution of the most important feast, in my opinion, in the church. And so I go off on my own. Terry and Jay went out to eat. I said, listen, I just want to go to the St. Peter's, in front of St. Peter's Basilica. And I'm there. And there wasn't a soul there. Not a soul. There was one young priest, and he was right next to me. And I guess we were probably both praying silently. And it was dark. And I understood the importance of the time and the importance of the event. And I'm thinking to myself, where are all the people? How is it possible that some no-name little dude from nowhere, Louisiana, is sitting in this place? It's the night before one of the most momentous days in the church's history. And me and one young priest are here. Wow. I mean, that mind-boggling, man, just mind-boggling. Well, the same, I guess, the knowing, and you see this in the Bible, it happens to people where, you'll get compelled, if you would, to walk a certain way or go. I had no plans. I had no idea where I was. I had a knowing to walk that direction. It was dark. It's in Rome, and I don't know a single street name. I don't know a single place. I don't know a single thing. It was completely and utterly just, and it wasn't scary. It was a comforting thing, but I was walking down the street where I didn't know where I was going. I had no idea why I was walking down the street. I was just walking down the street. Well, I walked down the street, and I don't know how many, buildings I passed, but I had a knowing to go to the right, and there it was, the doors to, I didn't know. I opened the doors, and it was the front doors to the Church of the Holy Spirit. What I didn't know was, probably, I don't know for sure, I can't say this for sure, that I really didn't know it was a church, but I doubt I knew it was a church, because the churches don't really look like churches, as I recall, in Rome, and there's so many buildings crammed together. It could have been looking like a church, so I could be wrong. But anyway, I ended up opening the door, and what I didn't know was there was this humongous image of Jesus standing with the rays, the red rays and the white rays. It's called the Divine Mercy image, right? And I knew about the Divine Mercy image, and if you read the book, you understand why it was created, and she had the vision of Jesus standing there. Well, before me is I don't know how many feet high. It's hard to remember exactly, but it was humongous, this massive painting of the Divine Mercy. No, I didn't know anything about this church. Well, as it turns out, this is where the Pope goes to venerate the image of the Divine Mercy. Not only that, But this is where all the nuns were staying who lived where St. Faustina was from in Poland. So it was her order staying in this church. And they had this beautiful Divine Mercy image there. And I had literally been led to the door and opened the door and I had no idea. Really, it wasn't until later that I learned all these facts about the fact that it was the place the Pope goes. I didn't know that. And where the nuns were staying. I didn't really know that. But at some point in time, I guess it blew my mind. It was the middle of the night. I ended up going, I left the church and went back. I think I went knock on the door and picked up Jay in the middle of the night. And I said, Jay, you got to come see this, man. And so we went back to the church and, you know, I want to say they were having a mass maybe at 3:00 at night and it wasn't in English or whatever. And I think it was after the mass. All of a sudden from behind the altar, this nun dressed like St. Faustina, same habit as she had. As it turns out, she was one of the nuns that lived where St. Faustina was from. Doesn't speak English, walks out. They had a couple of handful of people there. Walks out behind the, from the sacristy, and she walks right up to us, me and Jay, and she has something in her hands, and she's trying to give it to me. And I'm looking at it, and I recognize it's a ticket to the canonization. But I also recognize it was a different color than the one that we had received the previous day from Sister Grace Kelly, who was the original person that we got the original tickets from.
Was it one ticket or more than one?
Well, she had a bunch in her hand, or a number in her hand, and I want to say she must have handed us two, because at some point in time I said, I need a third, and so she handed me a third. Now, sinful that I already had a ticket and she's giving me three more and I'm accepting them. I don't know, but I had a sense, I guess, that these were pretty important tickets. If she's dressed like St. Faustina, I'm like, she might know something that I don't know. Well, we go back to our hotel, sleep for an hour probably, got up the next morning, and we go to the out in front of St. Peter's where they're having the canonization that day. And they have since that time, they have all these entrances, I guess. I think they must have been scanning stuff even back then. And you had to pass through the deal, and they checked to see if you had a ticket. So there's so many people, a lot of European people, Polish people probably, I suspect, they were pressing on you. You could hardly walk. I remember that part. But anyway, we go through the entrance. I'm sitting there holding my rosary above my head, trying to. People are pushing on me. I'm thinking to myself, I'm about to hurt somebody. I got to keep my calm. I'm at a canonization of a saint, and these people are literally about to knock me over.
Kind of like a concert.
It's rude. It was the rudest people. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, we're at a religious event, and I'm about to mow these Europeans down. I mean, I'm not kidding. I was trying to hold my temper, but we walked through, and I don't know if it was we handed them all 6 tickets for only 3 of us, or how we did it, but they looked at our ticket and they go, ooh, and might have mentioned something to the girl next to us, and then the next thing you know, somebody comes from the side and grabs us and literally walks us to our seats, past the next gate entrance, past the next gate entrance, past the next checkpoint. We're walking, and this is where the Pope is. He has his thing set up where he's going to say the Mass, and then they have seats on both sides of him, in front of him, the whole deal. Well, we're literally in the section right next to where the Pope's going to say Mass. And we're like, they had all kind of clergy around us, like cardinals and bishops and priests and nuns, and as I recall, very few normal people who were frauds, right? We were nobodies from nowhere, Louisiana, shouldn't have been there, and this nun who, out of the kindness of her heart, I guess she had a couple extra tickets, scored us these rock star tickets. So we ended up sitting. I could throw a baseball and hit the Pope and knock him out. Watch the whole canonization of Saint Faustina, front and center, and it was comical because I'm just looking around going, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? It's almost embarrassing, honestly. You feel like a fraud. I'm not important. These people are probably looking at me going, I wonder if that's his cousin, And so long story short, being who we were, nobodies, in that situation, only we knew we were nobodies. They didn't really know. And so you recognize immediately, oh my word, I was in adoration. Jesus told me to, I felt like God was telling me to come here. Leap of faith came here, didn't have a ticket. All of a sudden I'm standing out in front of St. Peter's. I get whisked away to the chapel where the Pope venerates the image. Some nun from Poland walks out and gives me a ticket. Next thing you know, I'm at the canonization. Now that's God. You add up all the risks or the probabilities, if you would. It's only God. And then the question then becomes, dude, he did this for us. Why did he do this for us? He didn't have to do this for us, but he did. I mean, he put on he put on the Ritz. What in the world? Why would he do such a thing and waste on us? Why would he do that? And so you start thinking about that. Well, then you start to realize, wait a minute. He's just putting another exclamation point on the fact that he really is serious about this divine mercy thing. He's really serious about you at least sharing with people about it, that it's really true. It's super important. And he's willing to waste it on you. Why? I don't know. But I thought to myself, man, I got to do something. I got to do something with this. He really, really wants me to teach about divine mercy. And I truly do understand it pretty well. I need divine mercy. I am not a saint. That's the point. Man, if he's using somebody like me, a sinner, to teach about divine mercy, I guess really and truly, who else should be? I have a PhD in it, in sinning. I'm sure God is disappointed at me on a daily basis. And so perhaps that's why, I don't know. But to know that he is giving me these signposts. Now, I knew at the time that I was to get involved with Catholic radio. And so I did. We ended up doing some Catholic radio shows. We did the Hour of Mercy, Paul, you, me. We did Catholic radio, and of course we teach on it anytime we get invited. But I would say that absolutely the most important book of my life, the most important message of my life, I couldn't possibly cover in this short period of time anything about it other than what I've said. I probably lasted too long, but it's beautiful. The two nuns, by the way, that we met in Rome, we ended up befriending. One of them is now one of my literally best friends, Wendy, Mother Wendy of the order now, and they formed an order in Ohio. They bought a mountain literally with all the money they raised, and they go around teaching on divine mercy, and she's literally one of my friends, closest friends and allies. I literally rely on her for good advice, but also friendship. So it's hard to explain how all these pieces of the puzzle fit together, but that story explains it perfectly, because there's so many things that happen so fast, and it has to be God. There's no other way to explain it. So I wanted to make sure my kids hear that story, my grandkids hear that story. And if they, my message to them is, hey, look, if you don't learn anything else from Knucklehead G, they call me G, please, whatever you do, grab this book. And if you could just read it once in your life and know it and understand it, it is so important. God's mercy. We don't deserve it. No. We're sinners, yes. But all you have to do is ask. It requires nothing more than a humility enough to ask for his forgiveness.
It requires trust.
Trust.
There's such saying, I cannot remember her name. Yeah. My sister, Minnie, was telling me about her, but she said that more people go to hell many people, because they don't trust in his mercy, truly trust in it. And what people need to understand is that no one sin is greater than God's mercy.
Right.
If your sin was greater than his mercy, you would have a lot of power.
Yeah.
Okay.
You think highly of yourself, huh?
That's correct. So in other words, he will forgive anything.
Yeah.
He just wants you to trust him and believe in his mercy.
One of my daughters, who is very angry with me right now because I had an outburst recently, right before I'm coming here, she writes, and I sent an apology text to her, and I love her, Mary Margaret, I love her. But she wrote me a text that said, Dad, apologies without change is manipulation. And I don't know if that's true or not. And I know I'm guilty, and I want to write her back, but I just don't even know how and what to say.
Maybe in its perfect form, but you have to try.
You have to try.
You just give it your best. We all got faults. You give it your best.
The worst part is I have to write her back and say, listen, by the way, chances are, and you know it, it's going to happen again sometime in the future. And despite my best efforts, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try. You have my word, I will try. I mean, that's all I can give you. Yeah. If you're not going to hang around me and you don't want to be around me because I'm going to mess up again, I'm going to mess up again because you've lived with me for 26 years and you've seen me mess up, then the guarantee is that I'm going to mess up. So you can't ever hang out with me if that's the case. But I'm going to try. You got my word on that. I'm going to try. So, but yet, trust, mercy, trust in God's mercy. It's a beautiful thing. It's the whole idea of trusting completely and utterly in God's providence. You and I both know, people ask all the time, what? I don't particularly love what I do. I love to serve people. I love to undo difficult, interesting things like puzzles, legal puzzles. I like kind of difficult stuff to keep my mind occupied, but I don't really love the practice itself. There are so many things about it that I'm convinced I'm not made for. And I forget where I was going with that, but nevertheless, I trust that God's providence this is what he wants me doing. And I literally, I don't, they say, well, get out and go do something else. Well, until I hear from God that he wants me to do something, or I have a knowing so deep in my chest that I just know that I have to go do something else. Until then, I'm like the young colt who is taught to stay still in the corral. Don't be running around lollygagging. Wait for your master to come tell you he's ready for you. And until then, you stay where you are.
Sister Nadine Brown, Intercessors of the Lamb, said, whenever you are discerning a big decision, that there will always be three things present. And she said, peace, joy, and bear good fruit. She said, if one of those is missing, it's not God's will. Mm-hmm. She gave an example once. She said that she was getting called to start another order. Mm-hmm. And she was bound to offer spiritual brothers and sisters and priests, and they would say, go, girl, go do it. But she didn't have any joy. She could see the peace, and she could see the good fruits. So she kept going before the Blessed Sacrament, and eventually the Lord told her, not yet. 6 months later, she got all three, then she did it. And one of the other things she says is whenever you've made a good discernment, when you have all three things, one of the ways you know you've made a good discernment is the devil will attack you right after you've made the decision to try to confuse you and make you think you messed up.
Yeah.
So don't move unless you have all three of those things.
That's right. That's right.
So
So again, thank you, Rick, for giving me the opportunity. I'm picturing in my mind my grandkids 20 years from now maybe getting a hold of this thing when I couldn't do it myself. And so I can't tell you how much I appreciate giving me this opportunity. This is one of the greatest gifts you've ever given me, in addition to the TV you're about to give me.
well, thank you very much for coming, Greg.
Thanks, Rick.